So today's lecture presentation, I'm going to work with you to introduce a general school of thought we reference as scholasticism or scholastic thought, scholastic philosophy, different kind of nomers for it. And one of the key illustrators of that, if you wish, school of thought, the author you're going to be covering now, who is Thomas Aquinas, right? So I want to start very, very briefly with this background painting that I chose. And the title says it all. This is Faith and Reason United. This is by Ludwig Geitz, 19th century. Now, scholasticism is certainly not 19th century. But what he's representing here captures the heart, if you wish, of what we might want to call the medieval synthesis, right? The synthesis between faith on the one hand and reason on the other hand. You should have already encountered some of those aspects with your previous authors, Ibn Rushd and Maimonides, right? So they were already, as we said last time, they were already trying to do something in terms of what is the place and role of philosophy, understood as rational philosophy, Greek philosophy, classical philosophy. What is the place and role of philosophy and philosophical thought in a monotheistic context, right? Zeitz's painting here captures this notion of faith and reason united, and this is what the scholastic tradition kind of also tries to capture. Certainly the author you're going to be reading, Thomas Aquinas. And if you look at the inscription there, this is the Latin inscription from the Pope at the time, Pope Leo XIII. It says, "The splendor of the divine truths received into the mind helps the understanding," right? So this relationship between reason and revelation, right? And as I said, this is something already we saw preluded with Ibn Rushd and Maimonides, though certainly Ibn Rushd and Maimonides don't fall into the scholastic tradition for reasons that I hope will become clear. The term itself, scholasticus, is really basically what captures here, right? Schoolman or school person in a more politically correct sense nowadays, but of course at that time it was mostly schoolmen. And it derives back from the notion of scholasticus, learned, studious, etc. Right? So this is the general terminology, but you'll see it'll find its roots literally in the schools, i.e. universities of Europe of the time. The first note I want to say before moving on to encounter some of the scholastic thought and tradition is that ages pursuant to the scholastic period, if you wish, didn't exactly think very fondly of it, didn't think highly of it. And many, many future generations and thinkers and whatever kind of look back in terms of a very critical eye on the scholastic tradition. This not long after the scholastic period, right? So already in the 15th century, you'll find Laurentius Valla writing about the scholastics, that superstitious and senseless race of professors who make their pupils swear never to contradict Aristotle. I myself have to control myself in class and not ask my students never to contradict Aristotle. I don't want to be superstitious and senseless, or maybe. So that's already in the 15th century, right? Later on, here's another example from the 19th century. This is from Hippolyte Taine, a humanist of the 19th century. He says, 3 centuries, speaking of the age of scholasticism, 3 centuries at the bottom of that gloomy abyss did not add a single idea to man's intellectual inheritance. Very positive evaluation of scholasticism. And the reason I like to start with these lovely evaluative remarks is then to say, well, what then are we doing reading scholastic tradition or reading exemplars or illustrations from the age of scholasticism? And I hope through today's presentation, you'll begin to formulate some answer to that question of the centrality. Because though, of course, Laurentius Valla and Hippolyte Taine and many others may be very, very critical of the age of scholasticism, there's also very good grounds to be positively critical, i.e. critique in the positive sense. To launch our presentation of today, I'm going to shift the focus slightly onto you and your clickers. And before I tell you about the scholastic tradition and Thomas Aquinas, the key author of today's presentation, I want you to engage with me in this slight imagine, if you will, exercise, right? So imagine, if you will, that you are a person of monotheistic faith, of some authority, and one with broad scholarly interests. And imagine that you were informed of the recent discovery of a corpus of works, a large body of works, lots of books, in a language of times past, and that the suspicion is that this corpus may hold much of the wisdom of the past, right? Great discovery, so much to be found in these works. What do we do? What would you do? Procure the corpus and make sure that no word of such a discovery gets out, until you can figure out what to do with it. Make sure that no word of such a discovery ever gets out and destroy the corpus, just burn it. Bring together a group of scholars to study and translate the corpus, or procure the corpus and sell it to the highest bidder. What would you do, right? This is the clickers, A, B, C, D. So it's basically a really large body of corpus, clearly contains much of the wisdom of the past. Most of it we had actually thought was lost. So what should we do with such a great body of works? Destroy them, sell them, sit down, try to figure out what to do with them, get a group of scholars to study them and translate them. Responses? Too slow, 17 responses. You're so hesitant. All right, any more responses? Going once, going twice. If you can get me to 20, just to satisfy my OCD. I don't have one, but why not? No? Okay, 18 is fine. It's 3 sixes, right? 78% voted to bring together a group of scholars to study and translate the corpus. Great. 6%, very entrepreneurial, will sell it. Right? 6%, destroy it. Lashou. Right? Brilliant. This is a liberal arts institute, by the way, the AUB. Yeah? And 11% a bit cautious. Let's try to figure out what to do with it. All right. So I anticipated the majority vote. Let's say now we do actually get a group of scholars, start to translate, start to study this. But the more you start to translate, the more you get into the text, the more you realize that the content of the works may or does stand in many of its respects challenging, so as not to say against, the accepted beliefs and traditions of our time, and that it may indeed on some level threaten the widely accepted worldview. Now what do we do? Do we make a public announcement of the discovery and its content, urging everyone to re-examine their beliefs and worldviews? Do we burn all the manuscripts and brand anyone who would ever mention them and their content as a criminal, heretic, etc. of sorts? Do we continue studying further and seek out from them what may indeed be useful to us? Or do we cover up the fact that they were being translated, pretend they just got discovered, and sell to the highest bidder? Right? So the idea is the more we study this, the more we translate it, some of the things we start to read start to come in some tension with our accepted worldviews and traditions. Might be a bit threatening. What do we do? Have you seen my coffee? Oh, it's right there. No 18 this time? Just a prime number? That works. Oh, there it is. Goody. Oh, 19 this time. All right. Oh, look at that. So 37% would actually make a public announcement and urge everyone, very, very liberal and revolutionary, urge everyone to re-examine your worldviews. The 47% will continue the studying. So their combination is actually higher than the percentage of those who wanted to study in the first instance, but maybe that was the 19th person, I don't know. 5% would still want to sell. That's fine. And 11%, I think it was 11% the previous one as well, right? Just burn it. Don't tell anyone. Shush, right? Nothing. It's a very important and central exercise in the 21st century, except the first time it actually happened was about 1,000 years ago, in the 11th century, in Spain, in Toledo. Because the exercise you just encountered was more or less what we reference as the Toledo event. Because after the reconquest, the European reconquest of parts of Spain in the 11th century, 1085 particularly, in fact, that is what happened. In the Library of Toledo, they discovered works which they had believed had been lost, mostly works of Aristotle and other Greek thinkers. And they had discovered works translated into Arabic. You read Ibn Rushd, his commentaries were there, but also in their original language, but also commentaries on these works. So it was an amazing treasure. It was an amazing find, right? And they were faced with a similar kind of question that you were faced with today. What do we do with this? Do we study it? Do we translate it? And the more we translate it, we realize it might challenge some of our accepted beliefs and tradition, but they did what you in the 21st century actually voted to do. They studied it. They got a group of people and began to translate it, and that's why we call it the Toledo event, because it was an event, right? The rediscovery of this great set of works from the Greeks, but now with the added value of Arabic translations, Hebrew translations, Arabic and Hebrew commentaries on them, right? Some abbreviations even of them, opens up almost like a snowball effect. And it begins in Toledo, but then, thanks to Google Earth, we can do this. Then it goes, it travels, it doesn't get stuck there, right? It goes from Spain, it finds great interest also in southern France, moves all the way down to Palermo, Sicily. Essentially, wherever you find kind of a natural coexistence of the three monotheistic faiths at the time, under the patronage of the rulers of the time, certainly, right? For instance, that was definitely the case in Palermo of the time, in southern France, and in Spain. These works became studied, and really a lot of interest poured into them from the various traditions, monotheistic traditions, I mean. And it develops, and it goes further and further up north towards England and Ireland and whatnot. And you get, for instance, in Sicily, in Palermo, you have William of Moerbecke's supposed first complete translation of Aristotle's Metaphysics. And it's an interesting side note, William Moerbecke may have been a friend, but at least an acquaintance of Thomas Aquinas. So that might have also been some influence on Thomas Aquinas later on. Now, if you were to take a wild guess about that event now, in the 11th century, who would you suggest, or who would you think was the main drive and engine behind the translation movement in Toledo? So we said, as you voted today, that's what they did. They sat down, got a group of scholars, and began to study it. But who do you think, when I say they, who's they? Who was behind this main move? Who supported it? Was it the common people of Toledo, the political powers, the archbishop, or the scholars and schoolmen of Toledo? Cast your votes. Who would be behind such a great move in studying and translation? No clickers? No, you have. 15 is a good number. 16, 17, 18. I'm going to go before the 19th shows up. Oh, they did. Yeah, I know. That was a trick question, because I mentioned scholasticism and scholars. And no, sorry. It wasn't the schoolmen and the scholars of Toledo. 10% wishful thinking, the common people of Toledo. Not yet. That's going to take some time. Political powers of Toledo, kind of. But actually, it was the Archbishop of Toledo, right? And I kind of gave you a hint when I showed that earlier. Toledo Cathedral, where housed the translators. And the reason I want to highlight this is, again, one of our cliches, and it is a cliche, that we reference quite often, is this notion of the monotheistic religious tradition in opposition to science and philosophy and whatnot, right? As Ludwig Zeit's painting at the beginning says, faith and reason united, a lot of the work that was done was precisely done under the patronage of the religious institutes, right? So it was the cathedral that actually housed these translators. It was the Archbishop Raymond, who pushed this and pushed for this. And at the end of the day, when we say schools at the time, remember, all schools were religious institutes. It's not like you had, civil society schools. I mean, who established the schools, including, of course, our very own here at the AUB, right? So it's a very interesting note to keep in mind, because it's precisely the people who one imagines were standing up against the advances, and we speak about the Dark Ages and medieval, and they weren't that dark. But it was actually, that's the places where these things were happening under the patronage. Now, of course, political power, obviously, right? That also plays a role. But political power and religious powers, you know, the line is very thin at the time. So do keep this in mind, as I asked you to keep it in mind when we're talking about Ibn Rushd and Maimonides, both of whom are very well-established, respected religious figures in their communities, as of course you'll see with Aquinas as well. But what I do want to say in terms of closing off this not so brief introduction, to suggest or to propose that it was the age of scholasticism, 11th century Spain, Toledo, I think King Alfonso or whatever, is what started this entire interest in the study and translation of Greek thought, that would be actually a bit of a misrepresentation. That interest was already there, right? Not as focused, not as fast-moving as it, you know, what we witnessed after the Toledo event because of the discovery of these works. But we can go back all the way to Boethius and move forward. And you'll find there's always been this kind of interest. In fact, Boethius, who we reference perhaps as one of the first, who became aware of the danger of losing the Greek heritage, right? As the, if you wish, the official language began to move more and more towards Latin and less Greek, he was worried that these Greek works would be lost, right? And so he decided to, he set himself to translating the works of Plato, for instance, writing commentaries. He wrote some really interesting stuff. His Consolation of Philosophy is one of the best known early examples of this kind of reason and revelation, which is a debate with philosophy, right? Very interesting. John Scotus Eriugena is a great character also in terms of this tradition before the Toledo event. And there's an interesting historical, if you wish, small detail that allows him to stand out. Whereas most of what you now call Europe or the West began to adopt Latin as the official language further up north, specifically in Ireland. He's Irish, that's what Scotus means, not Scottish. And Eriugena means Irish-born, so he's just Irish. In Ireland, Greek was still the language of education, right? So he had access to the Greek philosophical texts and traditions, and so he also had influence preserving some of those works and their studies. And this is one of, I like to reference this quote from him because, again, it captures what Ludwig Seitz later tries to capture. He says, Christ wears two shoes in the world, Scripture and nature. Both are necessary to understand the Lord, and at no stage can creation be seen as a separation of things from God, right? The notion of nature here has directly to do with natural philosophy and natural science, and so, as again you saw with Maimonides, who focuses on the centrality of knowing, understanding logic and natural science in order to address questions of the divine. Zipping quickly forward, of course, we have one of the most famous, perhaps, early influencers, Saint Anselm, who also was a big figure in the, if you wish, the prelude to the rise of scholastic traditions and the what we're calling the medieval synthesis. He's most famous for the ontological proof for God's existence and whatnot. Definitely had a lot of influence. Others like Abelard and many, many others. So my bottom line is the Toledo event was absolutely central somewhere in the 11th century, right? But there was already a tradition that they were building on. What the difference is, the big distinction is that the rediscovery of these works that they had assumed were lost to them, right? And so that's why after that event, you see really a great movement forward in the discussion of the synthesis, as we're calling here, the medieval synthesis between philosophy and revelation, or as Seitz calls it, between faith and reason. Good. So closing off this introduction, just a quick review question. Going back to the Seitz painting I had at the beginning. I don't know if you noticed, it's up there in that corner. Behind faith and behind reason, there's a small character in gray shading, grayscale, sitting and teaching on both sides, right? Who would you imagine is that character on both sides of the painting behind both faith and behind reason? Is it Pope Leo XIII? Is it Thomas Aquinas? Is it Augustine? Or is it Ibn Rushd? It's more kind of a, take a wild guess. Yeah. Ooh, there we go. Yes, absolutely. Half of you are right, the other half are wrong. It's not bad, right? Thomas Aquinas it is. Pope Leo the inscription was from Pope Leo. Augustine definitely had his influence because, Aquinas being there, you could say, yes, Augustine was there because Aquinas was influenced by Augustine. And Ibn Rushd certainly had influence. But no, yes, our author of this week, Thomas Aquinas, is sitting there in the background. And it's very significant because he's sitting in the painting, he's sitting both behind reason and behind faith. And in both depictions of him, he is surrounded by 3 or 4 children that he is teaching, right? So on both sides of the debate, so to speak. And with that, we move now to introduce the author you'll be working with, who I think, and you'll see, I hope, is a great illustration of what we're calling here the medieval synthesis of this scholastic tradition that wants to emphasize the place and role of reason, specifically philosophy, specifically the Aristotelian tradition, in the context of monotheism. Now, as I said in our last encounter, Ibn Rushd and Maimonides also have that. But the reason something different is developing here is now this becomes institutionalized. This becomes a mode of thought, a school of thought, which we reference as scholasticism, right? With Maimonides, it was there definitely as one possible school of thought. With Ibn Rushd also. Maimonides' approach and Ibn Rushd didn't fare too well after them, at least in their part of the world. It fared well in other parts of the world. But their influence in Toledo, of course, continues now with the scholastic tradition. But when I say institutionalized, I mean it's at the schools now, the universities. Mind you, not much of this was discussed off campus, so to speak, right? So all of these discussions were very comfortable going on the tension between philosophy and faith and whatnot, but on campus. Off campus is a different question. So very, very briefly, bios again, you can find them anywhere these days. So this is just a look at Thomas Aquinas. He was very influenced by the Averroists at one point, but then stood up and had an issue with the Averroists when he was in Paris. He returned to Paris and worked towards his doctorate of theology, which he received in 1257. Definitely influential in the development of the scholastic tradition. You're reading 2 selections, one from his Summa Contra Gentiles and one from his Summa Theologia. The Summa Theologia, very interesting, is left unfinished. He didn't complete it as he had a certain experience. And that's why I referenced Augustine earlier on. And he writes to his friend and secretary saying, after following that profound revelatory experience in 1273, he writes, "I can write no more. All that I have written seems like straw." Right? So there's a point in his life where he abandons writing in this tradition because he feels, in comparison to that revelatory direct experience which he has, everything he's ever written is like straw. But it's pretty good straw, as many who follow Aquinas and the scholastic tradition would definitely propose. So as I said, you're reading selections from 2 works, and what I want to do is just give you a quick overview of the breakdown of the first work you're going to, the selections from Summa Contra Gentiles. And here I think you will begin to see very clearly, with some illustration, the medieval synthesis that we're talking about. So it's a pretty phenomenal work. It's a very large work. It's in 4 books. Book 1 is of God, and it's 102 chapters, pardon. Book 2 of creation, 101 chapters. Book 3 of Providence, 163 chapters, and Book 4 of Salvation, 97 chapters. The title are very clearly monotheistic concerns, right? And these are clearly the questions of a devout monotheist, or as Maimonides will tell us, of a perplexed monotheist who wants to address these questions. When you go into some of the divisions of the chapters, here are, for instance, some sample chapters from the Book 1 of God. Chapter 13. Arguments in proof of the existence of God, right? And this is where you begin to see the entry in the place and role of philosophical and Aristotelian tradition. Arguments, proof of the existence of God, right? Chapter 20, that God is not body. Again, the title is the conclusion he will reach through a very clear philosophical argument. That God is his essence. Somewhat reminiscent of Maimonides' discussion. That no accident is found in God, that God is one, that God knows singulars, etc. And all of these are not proclamations of faith as such. They will be shown using philosophical methodology, right? That's the synthesis. What you're reading from book 1 are the following selections, author's intention and whatnot. And again, you'll see it, chapter 5, that the truth, the human reason is not able to investigate are fittingly proposed to men for belief. Reason, belief. Chapter 4, that the truth about God to which the natural reason reaches is fittingly proposed to men for belief, right? So again, this back and forth. Chapter 8, how the human reason is related to the truth of faith, right? This is the synthesis he's very much clearly engaged in. So let's look at the author's intention in the present work as he puts it down, right? Like Maimonides, he has this, and he says, here's what I'm going to be talking about, and here's why I'm going to be talking about it. So he writes, among all human pursuits, the pursuit of wisdom is more perfect, more noble, more useful, and more full of joy. And pray tell, what is the pursuit of wisdom? Crickets. Pardon? Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Yes, right? The pursuit of wisdom, Sophia, right? Sagesse. Good. So he sets it down very clearly. It is more perfect, more noble, more useful, more full of joy. And then he breaks down why it's more perfect. Because insofar as a man gives himself to the pursuit of wisdom, so far does he even now have some share in true beatitude. Right? And the language of beatitude is, of course, a very monotheistic Christian language. So you note the connection here between applying one's self to the pursuit of wisdom and then beatitude. It is more noble because through this pursuit, man especially approaches to a likeness to God who made all things in wisdom. Right? Faith, reason, the constant interplay. And since likeness is the cause of love, the pursuit of wisdom especially joins man to God in friendship. Right? It is more useful because through wisdom we arrive at the kingdom of immortality. It is more full of joys because her conversation hath no bitterness, nor her company any tediousness, but joy and gladness. Right? So the connector between faith and reason, or reason to faith, is very, very clear from the beginning for Thomas Aquinas. Then he goes on. And so, in the name of the divine mercy, I have the confidence to embark upon the work of a wise man, even though this may surpass my powers, and I have set myself the task of making known, as far as my limited powers will allow, the truth that the Catholic faith professes, and of setting aside the errors that are opposed to it. Right? And this he will do through employing the tools of philosophy and reason. Okay? So he writes, for instance, on the way in which divine truth is to be made known. The way of making truth known, says Aquinas, is not always the same. And as the philosopher has very well said, it belongs to an educated man to seek such certitude in each thing as the nature of that thing allows. But then there's a significant, if you wish, addition that Aquinas places, which I think, and I could be wrong, is already there with previous authors, whether within the tradition or outside the tradition, I mean, scholastic tradition. But see, he sets it down very explicitly. The two facets of divine truth, he says. There is a twofold mode of truth in what we profess about God. Some truths about God exceed all the ability of the human reason. And if you ask Maimonides, he'll say any question of essence about God. And of course, Aquinas fully agrees on that. Exceeds the human reason. But there are some truths which the natural reason also is able to reach. Such are that God exists, that he is one, and the like, etc. Right? So he sets down at the beginning a little qualifier in terms of the application of human reason and philosophy on questions of essence versus questions of existence. Right? Or if you wish, whatness versus isness. That God is, that he is one, and whatnot. These are questions that can be investigated through the employment of philosophy and human reason. What God is, if you remember Augustine, what then do I love when I worship God, or when I love God, right? That question is not a question of human reason, right? That's an important distinction. I think it's already there in some kind of undertone with Ibn Rushd and others before him. It's there with an overtone, explicit in Maimonides. But this is a central point that Aquinas sets forth. Because this is why you need, if you wish, the interplay between faith and reason. Because some questions cannot be addressed by reason, revelation. But even those questions that can be addressed by reason, Why would I need revelation then? Sorry, that was a question. I mean, if there are certain questions that he is one, that God exists, if these can be addressed by natural reason, he proclaims very clearly that they can. So why are they revealed? Why is God's existence revealed to us? Why is his unity revealed to us? Why not just let us be and we'll conclude it via reason? Judgment Day? Oh my Lord. How did we get to Judgment Day? In what sense? So allow me to take what you said and change it, right? But it'll be yours. It's not a sense of security as such, it's a reference point, right? How can I check my reasoning against what? Right? Yes, sir. In some sense, yeah, but the confirmation actually is coming from the side of reason now, not the side of faith, right? The idea is that that's revealed, my reason concludes it, oh, that makes sense now, what is revealed, right? So it's a feedback loop in contemporary language, right? Anyway, of course, I'm not going to address all of this. This is in the text you'll be reading and discussing in class. But the interplay between the two is absolutely important. There's a sense of security in checking my work and you know, if you wish, my reasoning, right? Because suppose I apply myself to the pursuit of wisdom and philosophy and I arrive at the conclusion that there are two gods, right? And suppose, as far as I'm concerned, my reasoning was flawless, okay? Revelation is a very important guiding principle, right? Clearly, I did something wrong in my reasoning because God, it's very clear, revelation, that there is one God, right? So in this sense here, you have reasoning to enlighten, to assist. And this is very important because when we're reading Aquinas, especially when you're reading the selections from the second work, the Summa Theologia, it is not addressed to convert. It's very, very important. Same thing with Augustine, right? It is addressed to ground my faith, right? To show the rational grounding of faith. But because the reason I'm bringing this up, because when I cover sometimes Aquinas and, you know, and we look at the proofs for God's existence and they say, well, you know, that's not convincing. That's not meant to convert you, right? It's meant to show you to as he says, sorry, why don't we just refer back to him, and the intention, okay? He says, okay. So, insofar as man gives himself to the pursuit of wisdom, so far does he even now have some share in true beatitude. So it assumes certain connection already with faith and the divine, right? It is more useful because through wisdom we arrive at the kingdom of immortality. But if I don't believe in the kingdom of immortality, that's not going to really be working that way. Good? So keep this in mind because the medieval synthesis is precisely about this movement from, if you wish, faith to reason to faith, right? What is it Augustine says? Believe in order to understand, and understand in order to believe. Good. So, as I just mentioned, well, Aquinas, not me, right? He says, and as the philosopher has very well said. So he does that a lot through his text. He references the philosopher, right? Numerous places he refers to him. Who do you think he means by this reference, the philosopher? Is it some abstraction, or does he actually maybe mean Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, or Averroes, Ibn Rushd, right? Who does he mean when he references the philosopher? أشهر من أن يعرف. Did I close the poll? I'm so sorry. I closed it at 1? I'm so sorry. Well, what did one person say? Wrong. I'm really sorry. I don't know how I closed the poll. Sorry. I'm really sorry. That doesn't count. But good job, one person. It's actually Aristotle, right? And the idea that Aristotle's influence is immense. That when I say the philosopher, come on. Hello? At some places he'll say the commentator. When he mentions the commentator, that's Ibn Rushd, right? Sorry about that. That should have been more fun. All right, so moving now to just give you a quick illustration of the method, of the scholastic method from Summa Theologia. So we've been talking about the scholastic school and the medieval synthesis and moving, you know, faith and reason. Here's an illustration that you cover and encounter from the second reading selection that you have. So it's very interesting. In the first reading selections you have, in the Summa contra Gentiles, he says very clearly, I can use reason to prove that there is God, to know that there is God, to know that he is one, etc. In the selections you're reading from the second one, that's exactly what he'll do. He'll present the proofs for God's existence, right? Now, the work, again, is huge. Like I said, it's not complete, but it's pretty big. The part 1 is 119 questions, 119 issues he addresses. Part 2, 303. Part 390, and then there's a supplement of appendices and treatises, right? So, for instance, these are not in your readings, but sample questions addressed in this text, again, to show this synthesis, right? So first part, chapter 11, the unity of God, the names of God, the power of God, all of these he will be addressing, again, moving back and forth between faith and reason. What is happiness, of the cause of love, of the external cause of sin? Go down to third part, 17, of Christ's unity of being, of the causality of Christ's resurrection, etc. And then you go to the supplement of the nature of confession, matrimony as a sacrament. So all the scope of the various questions within the tradition, right? From the oneness of God to resurrection to holy matrimony, right? Good. The selections you're reading are for first part, question 2, the existence of God. And this is something he presents in 3 articles. Whether the proposition God exists is self-evident, whether it is demonstrable, and whether God exists, right? And now you'll see a really good example of the scholastic method. So these are the questions he wants to address. Note, he doesn't start here. He doesn't say, does God exist? Let me show you. Because first, you might jump up and say, isn't it obvious that God does exist? Yeah, it's pretty self-evident. So we begin there. Right? Because there have been claims, and he mentions, for instance, John Damascene, Yohanna Dimashqi, as well as others, that God's existence is so self-evident, no one needs to prove it. Right? And so first he raises that question. Is God's existence self-evident? Then he goes to the next point, because suppose we say no. Suppose, as you'll see with Aquinas, that God's existence is not self-evident. All right, let's prove it. Somebody comes up and says, all right, it's not self-evident, but you can't prove it anyway. It's just something you just have to just accept, right? So the question, can it be demonstrated? Can it be proven? If yes, does God exist, right? Now, note the method he follows, and do follow this clearly, because if you miss this when you're reading him, you'll get a bit confused who's saying what when. He begins with 3 objections. These are not his objections, right? So his argument is the question of self-evidence, right? His thesis is that God's existence is not self-evident. The objections are the antithesis, not his, right? This is what he's responding to, okay? So there are 3 objections, or other words, 3 claims that God's existence is self-evident, right? The first says, the knowledge of God is naturally implanted in all of us. This is, as I mentioned, John Damascus, right? Or John the Damascene. The second, as soon as the name God is understood, it exists mentally, and it also follows that it exists actually. This is actually a reformulation of St. Anselm's argument, right? And the third, if there is anything true, there must be truth, but God is truth itself. I am the way, the truth, and the life, therefore God exists, is self-evident, right? So these are the claims that he's going to be responding to, right? This is a summary of 3 claims, as he calls them, objections. God's existence is self-evident, yeah, Thomas, you don't need to prove it. Right? He replies, in summary, right, to these. If the proposition God exists is self-evident, how come some people doubt it? Because the nature of something self-evident is that you can't doubt it even if you wanted to. It is evidence for itself, right? So he says, but the opposite of the proposition God is can be mentally admitted, i.e. mentally I can say God is not. Now, if something is self-evident, I shouldn't be able to propose that, right? The fool said in his heart, there is no God. Therefore, that God exists is not self-evident. Of course, that's not his proof, right? He will go replying to each of the objections. Good? So, set of objections, not his. That's what he's going to respond to. Brief response to them, the 3 replies, and the counter-argument, right? So, for instance, to the first one he replies, the first one being the knowledge of God is naturally implanted in all of us. He says, to know that God exists in general and confused way is implanted in us by nature. This, however, is not to know absolutely that God exists. Right? So we have a kind of a, and he gives a nice anecdote. He says, if you see someone crossing the street, that's very different from seeing Peter crossing the street. Right? So we have a kind of a ambiguous kind of sense. But it's not known. It's not something we know. The second one, with Anselm's idea, and again, I'm not going to go into the details, especially with that one. I hope you'll address it in detail in class. The idea that the moment you understand what the name God denotes, right? Anselm says, the being than which none greater can be conceived possible. Right? Whatever you conceive of as a being, God is that being than which none greater can you conceive or think. Okay? And Aquinas kind of says, yeah, to those who understand God in that sense, yes, I mean, that works. But is that what we normally go around thinking of? When I say, I get stuck in the elevator and I say, oh, God, help me. And you say, what do you mean, God? And I say, that being than which none greater can be conceived possible. I don't think so. That's not our commonplace understanding of the divine, right? And so he says, perhaps not everyone who hears this name God understands it to signify something than which nothing greater can be thought, right? For a lot of us, God is still God, not God, but our conception of God still, at least to my view, feel free to disagree, it's a bit polytheistic, right? I gave, you give me back. Right? A bit of trade relationship with Zeus. We've carried it over, great inheritance. And that doesn't sound like the being than which none greater can be thought possible. To the third objection, the objection that, if I say there is truth, and God is absolute truth in monotheism, right? So if I say there is no truth, but that is a truth. So it's impossible to deny truth without affirming it. Does that make sense? Right? If I say there's no truth, I'm saying the truth is there's no truth. So in a similar manner, it's kind of, if you deny God, that's kind of because God is truth, right? And Aquinas says, the existence of truth in general is self-evident, but the existence of a primal truth, of an absolute first truth, no, I'm sorry, that's not self-evident. Right? So again, distinguishing. Okay? So this is his methodology. When he goes to the second question, the question of whether God can be demonstrated. So the idea here, on every question, he'll set forth the objections, which are not his, right? He'll summarize them, explain them when needs be. Summary response, then he replies to them one. Conclusion, moves on to the next question. So the conclusion of the first one is God's existence is not self-evident. Therefore, we must prove it. The second set of objections is, well, guess what? You can't prove it for these reasons, which I'm not going to go into, right? And again, he replies to each one, right? And then summary. And then he says, when an effect is better known to us than its cause, from the effect we proceed to the knowledge of the cause. And from every effect, the existence of its proper cause can be demonstrated, etc. The sum of the argument is, you cannot prove God's existence because we may know his effects, but we don't know his, the nature of the cause. Because as we said, and Aquinas admits, reason cannot know the essence of the divine, right? So how can you prove the existence of something you don't know? Right? Suppose I want to prove the existence of Schweit. Right? Don't ask me what that means. I'll tell you how it's spelled, though. Right? None of you can prove the existence of Schweit unless you know what I'm talking about. Right? So if I want to prove the existence of God, I need to know what God is. That's the objections. That's not Aquinas. Right? Aquinas' response is, you don't need to know the essence of God. You need to know the meaning of the term. Right? Because all we're doing is tracing back from the existence of of effects to a cause. We're not tracing back to knowing the essence of the cause. Right? That's very brief. If it's not clear, fully understandable, I hope you'll address it further in your class. Having shown that God's existence can in fact be demonstrated, he goes on to the final question, does God exist? Right? So he demonstrates it. Not with one proof, not two, not three, but five. And I really want to ask you this, as he does. Right? None of those proofs alone works. It's not like you can isolate them and say, oh, look, no, right? First of all, they work the five together. He's very clear on that. More importantly, look at the conclusion of each of his proofs, at least in translation as we're reading it. It doesn't say, and this is God. It says, and this we understand to be God. And this we comprehend to be God, right? Because to say this is God is to say essence. Right? He will definitely not reference God's essence, but he will reference what we understand to mean when we use the term God, right? So there's 5 proofs for God's existence there presented together, which in many ways are a full demonstration of what he says in the first part of your readings, the first selection, that human reason can address the question of God's existence, that he is one, and so on and so forth. So at the conclusion of this presentation, I hope you've gotten some sense of why it is so powerful and central to look at this tradition, the scholastic tradition. مع احترامنا what was his name? Laurencio Valla and Hippolyte Taine and others. But actually one of my favorite conclusions and reflections on the scholastic era comes from a somewhat recent book by Rubinstein called Aristotle's Children. And I'd just like to just leave you simply by reading this conclusion from Rubinstein. He says, in reliving the Aristotelian revolution, we understand that we are not just the children of Copernicus and Galileo, Adam Smith, Thomas Jefferson, but Aristotle's children, the heirs of a medieval tradition that seems more intriguing and inspiring as the shortcomings of modernity become clearer. Of course, most of us would not return to the Middle Ages if we could. Few people today would embrace the assumptions and conclusions of the medieval scholastics. But the Aristotelians' quest for meaning is also ours. And we have much to learn from their vision of a science infused by ethics and a religion unafraid of reason. In this little known but formative chapter of our history, we may detect hints of a more humane and integrated global future, end quote by Richard Rubinstein. And thank you for your attention. Please make sure you give back the clickers that you took so you can get back your ID thingies.